and they're sharing resources with that tree, and they're all connected through this wonderful root system. So when one of these dies back, which they tend to do, it can actually return nutrients back into the system to support its sister trees. So clonal regeneration is important. Shade tolerance is also important. Redwood trees are one of the most shade-tolerant timber species. They can sit under a shaded canopy for a century without hardly growing at all. Then a little canopy gap forms because of a single tree fall, for example, and those little stems will sprout right up. No problem. It will create leaf tissue and grow very quickly under those situations. They also do something that's called epicormic sprouting. So if they are sitting under the canopy shaded for 100 years, they're not going to have a lot of leaf tissue. For a fir tree in the Sierra Nevada, that might be a problem, right? It'll never have a chance to put out that foliar tissue it needs. For a redwood tree, as soon as the sun hits it, it will start sprouting from the stem as well. It doesn't just set up sprouts from the base, it can send out sprouts from any point on the tree. So it sits under the shade for 100 years, sun hits it, all of a sudden it's fully leafed out, it's very happy. And then what I call self-thinning, something that happens in the coast redwood forest without anybody going in there and doing anything. And this is one of the things we were really looking at in our natural recovery study, was to see if redwood forests could self-thin. I'm going to try to show a minimum of graphs so everyone doesn't fall asleep, but I think there's a couple, sometimes I have to show you some numbers. So these are results from our research in Big River and Mendocino County on a chronosequence of recovering stands. Chronosequence means that we looked at a variety of stands at different ages at the same times. So we had stands from 0 to 20 years, stands from 21 to 40 years, 41 to 60, 81 to 100, 101 to 30, and we compared all those to old growth stands. And said, what is stand density on these various stands at different ages? And we found, in fact, that it was highest on the youngest stands, and then it started to decline naturally without anyone interfering, and then dropped down around 40 years to levels equivalent with old growth, with a few bumps along the way, but definitely a decrease in density over time. Just to clear that graph out of your head and to use something a little bit more experiential, here it is in pictures. So this is a 0 to 20-year-old stand. This is a 21 to 40-year-old stand. You can see something happening between that one and that one, right? It's opening up, not so many little tiny trees. 40 to 60 years. Now it's really starting to open up. You can see all those dead trees laying around on the ground. A few stumps there with actually the sprouts falling down off of the stumps. You can see how that's happening. And here's 80 to 100 years. Fewer and larger trees. Then 100 plus years there. And then an old growth stand there. And 100 plus years is really starting to look a lot more like that old growth. The spacing between the trees, the size of the trees, and something else you might notice that's starting to emerge in that. All these little plants on the forest floor, the understory species. I'll run through a couple of other results on this. This is a size class analysis of these same age groups. You can see 0 to 20, 21 to 40, etc., these age classes across here. And then what these different bars are the sizes of trees broken up into classes. So the smallest trees are the lightest, the biggest trees are the darkest. And you see what you might expect to see. Lots of little trees in the beginning, lots of, a more even distribution in the end with some bigger trees in it. But what was encouraging to us is we saw this curve moving across toward something that looked more like that curve over time. And this was one of the things that foresters were really concerned about, that we would never get to a point where we had any of these big trees because there were so many little trees crowded together that the big trees wouldn't be allowed to develop. The other thing that was a little bit surprising about this was how many little trees, how many little trees were still in the old growth. So this argument that we need to go and thin the forest because there are too many little trees doesn't really make sense. If you look at this, there's almost as many little trees in the old growth as there were in the 0 to 20-year-old stand. Canopy cover, another measure, standard forestry measure. also increased with time across this chronosequence, reaching something equivalent to old growth about 80 or 100 years. And we found a lot of the features, sort of standard silvicultural forestry features that we were looking at, hit this mark at around 80 years, 80 to 100 years. I mean, they recovered these standard density types of metrics around that period of time. So in 80 years, you can get something kind of like an old growth forest if you leave it alone. Okay, and now we're hitting this important part for this talk, the understory reinitiation. And this is something that hadn't been studied before and that we found mixed results on. So I'll start with something positive. Non-native species cover. One of the wonderful things about a forest canopy closing in a high density forest is you can get rid of a lot of species that are sun-loving. So, and very exciting that we found absolutely no non-native species on most of the plots that were older, 81 to 100, 130, and somewhere to old growth. There are occasionally some non-native species that get in there, but it was such a low level they didn't even get recorded on our plots. So they drop out naturally. And this is a PCA analysis. I know you've seen those before in this class, so I don't know how much you understand that, but I'll try to walk you through it. It's a cluster analysis, and we have two different axes with different metrics on it. On the vertical axis, we have some redwood forest plants, honeysuckle, modesty, and poison oak. And then on the x-axis, some more of these understory plants. Trillium ovatum, there's our star, finally coming back into the picture. Redwood sorrel, redwood violet, sugar scoop, and fairy slipper. And so we were looking at it to see how these different species were clustered across this chronosequence. So we found something really interesting. So this big red polygon that just popped up, that is a cluster of the 0 to 20-year-old stands. That's where they sat on this PCA. Okay, now this is the 21 to 40. You see how it's kind of migrating across? Now the 21 to 41 to 60, 81 to 100, 101 to 30, and the old growth. So the community of species is migrating towards something closer to old growth over time. That's good, very encouraging. So now I'm going to look at a few of these individually. So our Douglas iris, our vanilla leaf, and our sugar scoop. These three species, which are all redwood forest associated, did not recover very well within our chronosequence. There's a little bit of recovery. You can see some upward trajectories for some of these species, but they didn't really hop up here to old growth conditions. So this is something that may be very concerned about understory species as an area that needs to be researched further. Trees grow back fine on their own, but what about all the other critters that are connected to the forest? Some better news for these three species. We've got our fairy slipper, our redwood violet, and Trillium, our star species. For these three species, we saw really nice trajectories of recovery over this chronosequence. And the big bold line is Trillium ovatum. So I really like how linear this recovery was. It makes it potentially a really good metric for measuring the recovery of the rest of the forest. Which brings us to this new study, the one that I am putting together right now. I have a proposal in at the Save the Redwoods League, which hopefully will be funded starting in January. If you have any friends who are botanists who want to come work for me, or you want to change from birds to plants or something real quick, now's the time. The Save the Redwoods was very excited about the proposal, so I expect it to be funded. Anyway, so why did I pick this particular species, Trillium, besides the fact that I think it's beautiful? Some really good reasons. There's a known association with old growth forests. There's a body of literature that supports the fact that Trillium ovatum is sensitive to logging and that it is associated particularly with old growth forests. We don't have that body of literature for any of the other understory species. It's also associated with the range of coastal redwood itself. It grows across the Pacific Northwest and is also associated with old-growth Doug fir forest. But in California, where it grows in a range very similar, if you lay the two on top of each other, to the coast redwood range. So it has an association with that forest type. And then it also has 4 distinct developmental stages, which allows us to look at the plant, in a sense, over time. And these 4 stages are the cotyledon stage, this one right here, which is very hard to distinguish in the field, the one-leaf stage, which I spent years trying to figure out what this plant was, and finally realized, oh, it's just a baby Trillium. And then we have the 3-leaf vegetative stage, and it will stay in these 3 stages for a minimum of 18 years. It does not reproduce until it's 18 years old. So it reaches its adulthood about the same time as a human does. So we know if we have flowering Trillium that there has been a low level of disturbance for at least about 18 years. So that's a really nice piece of information to have when you're looking at this for a potential indicator of recovery. Okay, I just had to throw this picture in because this is my favorite picture I think I've ever taken. And I took it by accident. I was trying to take a picture of a Trillium with a flower in it, but I didn't notice at the time there's a little ladybug in there pollinating the flower. So that's pretty neat. They have a really neat association with different critters and pollinated by a variety of different insects. And the seeds are spread, it appears, almost entirely by ants. Just a little factoid for you. Okay, so I have this current research proposal to look at this particular flower as an indicator of forest recovery. And the proposal is going to start out by looking at it in 2 different areas. The first is in the Santa Cruz Mountains, a place that I know and love, and hopefully, how many people have been to the Redwood Forest in this area? Oh, good. If you haven't, join my 173 class in the spring and we will go there. And in this area, I'm going to use this new area that was purchased by a consortium of nonprofit groups, including the State of the Redwoods, called the San Vicente Redwoods, formerly the Cemex property. And this area will be used to develop a chronosequence. In addition, I'm going to be collecting some baseline data for their management strategy, which includes some preserved areas, the dark green, some restoration reserves. This is the name that makes me a little nervous. And we've been arguing back and forth about what are we going to do to restore the forest. And then the working forest, I think I have to stop and talk about what that means. A working forest, for me, is a forest that's left alone, because a forest works really hard when no one's bothering it. It works hard to collect carbon, to produce watershed, to support species. What this means is a bunch of guys, sorry to be sexist, a bunch of people working in the forest, cutting down trees. So a working forest means a managed forest in this case. So a large part of this new property is going to be managed for timber products, and then some areas will not. So I'll be collecting data across this landscape, so there'll be baseline data for each one of these to see, well, what happens if you keep managing it? What's that going to do to the understory species? What happens if we do these various types of restoration? What's that going to mean? And what's going to happen to the preserves? So in addition to this area, we'll also be looking at Fall Creek unit of Henry Cowell State Park, which is right here next to San Vicente, and then Big Basin Redwood State Park for an old growth comparison. So that'll be here in Santa Cruz, and then again in Mendocino County, one of my favorite haunts. We'll be looking at a newly purchased piece of property here in the Big River watershed, which was also recently purchased for state parks. And this has a wonderful, well-recorded chronosequence. A lot of the data that I showed you before and with those graphs was from this Big River watershed. So we're going to add in this piece. And this is the Russell unit of the Headlands, Mendocino Headlands State Park, my grandparents' old property here, which is primarily old growth. So we'll use that as well. So we'll have our old growth, some of our older second growth stands, and our newer second growth stands. So a similar setup that we have in Santa Cruz to look at up in Mendocino. So it's probably going to be a 2-year project. We'll do the Santa Cruz ones this year. We'll do the Mendocino one next year. And research design is going to be 20 quadrats, 50 by 50 meter quadrats across 5 strata, age classes, and 3 replicates for each for 2 study years, about 600 samples. So plenty of chances to explore different forest areas. And in each of these, we're going to gather the presence of this population of trilliums. Here, we're going to look at population size as well, and how many populations in each of these quadrats, and the life stage of individuals within each one of these plots. We'll also look at forest stand structure and species dominance. So some of these metrics I was talking about before, how big are the trees, how many trees are there, what species do we have, so that we can see if the Trillium metrics relate to those metrics. We'll also be looking at the abundance of woody understory species, shrubs, huckleberry, poison oak, those sorts of things. And the presence of old growth features, things that I was talking about before, the fire hollows, the large lateral branches, etc. And some basic physiographic metrics, landform, aspect, elevation, and that sort of thing. So all I need now is field assistance. I had to throw this in. I apologize for people who are tired to hear about my kid. But right now my only field assistant is, this is Trillium Russell with a trillium flower, so it's a trillium with a trillium. And she's always happy to go out with me and look at the plants, but I'm thinking I might need a couple of adults to help me with this as well. All right, and just a few references for you. Read those quickly, jot them down, and then on to questions.
All right. Great. Questions?
Yeah.
You might have mentioned it. Is the Trillium a resilient plant? I mean, like, I remember stepping on those and kind of a little kid and running through the woods. I didn't really know how important they were.
Well, that's a good question, yes. If you're with me and you step on them, you'll probably get a whole lot of protective behavior. They are individually not very resilient. If you step on them, that particular leaf structure is probably going to die. The good thing is they have underground rhizomes, which survive year to year. So as long as it's had enough time to photosynthesize throughout the year, and it's gathered some more nutrients underground in its rhizomes, it'll probably come back that following year. It's not as resilient to severe soil disturbance. So because it's an underground rhizome type species, if we dig it up, if we trample it, if we drive over it with a bunch of trucks, or drag logs across it, then it's not as likely to come back.
Just a quick follow-up, what about herbicides?
What about herbicides? That's a really good question, and I haven't studied this or considered putting in my proposal, but it might be something really interesting, because as herbicides are being used in forestry, and they're talking about using them in San Vicente as well. There's a lot of debate going on about that. It would be interesting to see if there's any correlation between the places where herbicides are being used and where they're not. So that's a really good point, and I think we'll have that data because we're going to have a whole lot of harvest data, in terms of what they're doing on each spot. And we can see, well, is there a relationship? There very well could be. The types of herbicides that are currently being used are supposed to be targeted to hardwood tree species, but yeah, I'm not sure what effect they might have. Something could also be done in the lab. Might be interesting, though. I'm not one who wants to torture trilliums in the lab, but we could grow trilliums in the lab and spray them with herbicides and see what happens. Yeah.
So you mentioned that they have like an 18-year cycle for maturity, and that they're associated with old growth forests among coastal redwoods. My question is, do different species of trillium have similar life cycles of maturity, and are they necessarily most often associated with old growth forest? I mean, I'm from the northeast, northern New York State. We have lots of trillium.
Right. Yeah.
Beautiful trillium.
That's a good question. There are a whole lot of different species
How can
of trillium.
How can it be a template for other?
Yeah. I first of all, I have to say I don't think it's exactly one-to-one comparison.
Yeah.
But there has been research done on other species of trillium that has shown that they are sensitive to disturbance. And there has been other species of Trillium that have been shown to be associated with different types of old growth forests. I don't know enough about all these different species to be able to point to this one or that. And we actually have a couple of different species of Trillium that grow around here as well. We have one called maculatum, which is much more rare, but does not necessarily seem to have the same connection to old growth that ovatum does.
Is that the one with the purple?
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's big,
very
big
huge,
leaves in the,
yeah.
yeah. I was disturbed to see in Henry Cowell last year, I'd seen some of these come up near the gift shop in Henry Cowell parking lot. And the next year, they dug up that whole area to plant native plants and create a little native plant garden. I was like, oh, you guys didn't know we have really interesting native plants in this already there. Now there's a big bench sitting there.
Redwood bench.
Anyway, yeah, a bench made out of redwood. Yes.
We've talked about this before, but I continue to be interested in the sort of ecotone redwoods that have the oak forests that, I don't know if the oak forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains are, if they expanded after the redwood harvest, or if some of them are older growth, but with the sudden oak death and certainly the tan oaks disappearing, but now also the live oaks disappearing, have you seen anyone studying what's going on at that ecotone with the redwoods, if they're taking advantage at all, or anything about that?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually, and one that someone from San Vicente sent me when I put up this proposal. I'm like, well, they said maybe we should come up with some other indicator species for the tan oak forest, because what they're trying to do there is manage away from tan oak by hacking and squirting.
They're managing themselves, don't worry about that.
I agree. I was like, well, we have some oak deaths. Why don't we just inoculate it with that? But they're hacking, and they want to hack and squirt up there. You say, well, we don't have Trillium up there, so should we be looking at other species as indicators? For me, that's kind of a backwards way of thinking about it. If we don't have Trillium up there, maybe we should be thinking about this site. First of all, what's the history of that site? Was it ever dominated by redwoods? There's kind of a misconception among managers, I've noticed across the redwood range, that everywhere should have giant redwoods growing on it. Historically, everywhere didn't have giant redwoods growing on it. They're very particular. They like alluvial flats, they like areas with a lot of water. And mixed into the redwood forest, anywhere you go, are areas that are have marginal site quality. They may have a few redwoods in them, but maybe they'd be dominated by oaks. Maybe they're always dominated by oaks, and maybe they're supposed to be. Hopefully I'll pick up some of that in this study. I'm planning on distributing the samples broadly enough that we can see, well, on a ridge top, where there's a little bit of redwood and more oaks, do we have Trillium at all? In that case, is it really a good metric for recovery, or is it just a matter of we're leaving this particular community and so it's not around anymore? So I think that's important. It's going to be important for the value of that metric. I don't think it's probably going to be useful everywhere, where it's probably most likely to be useful in areas that really were dominated by big redwoods to begin with, and we want to get them back.
My other question was, do the logging companies keep any data that they're willing to share about what happens when they do selective logging? I know that their religion is that you cut some trees and then the others will grow bigger.
Yeah.
Do they ever measure or record?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a long-term project going on in the Casper Creek watershed, led by a guy, Kevin O'Hara, up at UC Berkeley, who spent his career thinning trees and then measuring how fast the remaining ones grow. And if you cut some of them, the remaining ones will grow faster. That's what we know. But that doesn't equal more biomass on the landscape. It just means that those individual trees will grow faster. So my argument for ecological recovery is like, well, who cares? Who cares how big the individual trees are? In fact, having some smaller trees and trees that are damaged and trees that are going to fall down and knock into each other may lead to more habitat heterogeneity, which leads to more possibility for wildlife habitat and that sorts of things. So I don't see a correlation between growing big trees fast and forest recovery. But there is pretty good evidence that you want to get more big trees faster to thin out the trees. And so that's why the timber companies have been thinning for years. Anytime you do a logging operation in the coast redwoods, you go back in 10 or 20 years, do what's called a pre-commercial thinning, cut out a lot of that little stuff, then go back in about 30 years, cut out some, in a commercial thing, cut out some more, send them to the paper mill, and then you'll get some nice big merchantable logs quicker than you would otherwise. But you don't necessarily get more Trillium, right?
Question.
Yeah.
So it seems like there are kind of two tacks to protecting these systems. One is kind of the protecting the actual forests themselves, but also it seems like there might be, you mentioned a shift in what the commodities actually are, like where are the end uses. So it seems like we could essentially stop buying redwoods if we're redwood products. So what has that shift looked like over the last, however you've been studying this and however long, and you know, who buys this stuff now? Where is the bulk of this product being sold today, and are there competing things that we could be buying instead?
Well, it's a Home Depot. Every lumber company in California. Redwood is still very popular. People buy it for decks, they buy it for fences. It's extremely popular, and it's still relatively cheap because it's subsidized massively. So, are there alternatives? Yeah, I mean, if you're going to build a deck, you could build it with something else. They have all these new generation tracks and these sorts of things, which I'm not very excited about because they're usually a bunch of wood pulp glued together with some sort of plastic. And so what's the end result of that? Landfills full of this